An army that didn't exist, yet saved thousands of lives. In the spring of 1944, along the blood-soaked roads of France, German officers peered through binoculars at what appeared to be entire American divisions gathering for assault. Tanks lined the horizons. Radio chatter crackled with urgent commands. The rumble of engines shook the earth through the night. But if those officers had walked closer, if they had dared to touch those steel machines, their hands would have passed through canvas and rubber. They were hunting ghosts. This is the story of 1,100 men who waged war without firing a shot. Artists who painted deception across battlefields. Sound engineers who made silence roar. Soldiers who discovered that in war, sometimes the greatest weapon is the lie that saves a life. This is the story of America's Ghost Army. And for 50 years, no one was allowed to know they existed. June 1944. The Allied invasion of Normandy had torn open Hitler's Atlantic Wall, but the war was far from won. Beyond the beaches, beyond the hedgerows of France, lay a continent strangled by Nazi occupation. Every mile forward cost blood. Every river crossing, every town liberated, demanded a price measured in the lives of young men who would never see home again. The Germans were not collapsing. They were retreating, yes, but with discipline, with fury, with the desperate knowledge that every day they held the line was another day to fortify the fatherland. Wehrmacht divisions, battle-hardened and ruthless, watched the Allied advance with cold calculation, waiting for the moment to strike back. And the Allies faced an impossible mathematics. There were not enough men, not enough tanks, not enough divisions to be everywhere at once. The front stretched for hundreds of miles, and every commander faced the same agonizing choice: where to concentrate force, and where to leave gaps that could become gravesites. General Eisenhower knew the truth that haunted every night. Wars are won not just by what you have, but by what the enemy thinks you have. What if an entire division could be in two places at once? What if the enemy could be made to see armies where none existed? What if deception itself could become a weapon? In the halls of military planning, far from the front, an idea took shape. An idea so strange, so audacious, that it seemed to belong more to theatre than to war. But war, after all, is the oldest form of theatre. And this war would need actors who could make the impossible appear real. They would need artists. They would need men who understood that reality is what we believe we see. They would need an army of ghosts. In early 1944, while the world's attention focused on the coming invasion, a peculiar recruitment began across the United States. The army was searching for a different kind of soldier. Not the strongest, not the fastest, not even necessarily the bravest. They wanted painters, sculptors, fashion designers, architects, advertising men, set designers from Broadway, sound engineers from radio studios, students from art schools who could sketch a tank in minutes or mold clay into the face of a general. The recruitment officers visited the finest art schools in America. They walked through the studios of New York's advertising agencies. They knocked on the doors of men whose hands knew brushes better than rifles. "Your country needs you," they said. But they couldn't say why. And so they came, 1,100 men, most barely out of their 20s, who traded their drafting tables and easels for olive uniforms. Men like Bill Blass, who would later become one of America's most celebrated fashion designers. Ellsworth Kelly, whose paintings would one day hang in the world's greatest museums. Art Kane, whose photographs would define a generation. But in 1944, they were simply soldiers reporting to Camp Forest in Tennessee, utterly bewildered by what they'd been asked to join. They were told they were now part of the 23rd Headquarters Special Troops, a designation that meant nothing, a unit that officially barely existed. Their training began not with marksmanship, but with magic tricks, not with combat maneuvers, but with stagecraft. They learned to inflate rubber tanks using air compressors, 40-foot Sherman tanks that 2 men could carry, entire convoys of trucks and artillery pieces, all hollow, all fake, but from a distance, from the air, through binoculars in trembling hands, indistinguishable from the real thing. They practiced sonic deception, playing recorded sounds of tank battalions, of construction equipment, of thousands of men preparing for battle. Sound engineers adjusted speakers to carry across miles, creating phantom armies in the darkness. They studied special effects, how to create fake tire tracks with rollers, how to scatter equipment to suggest an entire base, how to paint shadows that made canvas look like steel. And they learned radio deception, the spoof radio, where operators would mimic the communication patterns of real divisions, creating an invisible web of chatter that enemy intelligence would intercept and believe. One soldier later remembered, "We felt like we'd been drafted into a circus, but they kept telling us, this circus might save the war." By the time they shipped to England in May 1944, just before D-Day, they still didn't fully understand their mission. They were about to learn that illusion in war is as deadly as any bullet, because the enemy you deceive is the enemy who fires at shadows while real men advance unopposed. They arrived in France in July 1944, just weeks after the Normandy landings, when the hedgerows still smelled of cordite and death. The Ghost Army's first mission came quickly: Operation Elephant. The objective: make the Germans believe that two full divisions were preparing to attack near the town of St. Lo, while the real American forces moved elsewhere. Under cover of night, they worked. Inflatable tanks rose like strange beasts in the darkness, their rubber skins catching moonlight. The men positioned them carefully, mimicking the spacing of real armored units. They hung camouflage netting. They painted unit markings. They created dummy supply dumps, stacks of crates that were empty, fuel barrels filled with water. When dawn came, German reconnaissance planes flew overhead, and they saw an entire armored division. The Ghost Army soldiers stood in the tree line, watching the planes circle, holding their breath. Everything depended on distance, on the enemy not looking too close, on the morning light hitting the canvas just right. The planes banked away, the deception held. German artillery, responding to the phantom threat, poured shells onto empty fields. German divisions repositioned to counter an attack that would never come. And miles away, the real American forces advanced against lighter resistance. The Ghost Army had drawn the enemy's eye, and real soldiers, whose names the Ghost Army would never know, lived because the Germans were shooting at ghosts. But success brought no celebration, because these men understood something that weighed on them every night. They were professional liars in a profession where lies cost lives. If they failed, if the deception was discovered, real units depending on them would walk into ambushes. Their fake tanks would become markers for slaughter. One soldier wrote in his diary, "We create the lie, and then we pray it holds." Over the following months, the Ghost Army moved like shadows across France. Operation Brest, Operation Viersen, Operation Bouzonville. Each mission a carefully orchestrated deception, each one requiring them to become, for a few crucial days, something they were not. They learned the rhythm of it. The trucks would arrive at dusk, carrying the deflated equipment. The men would work through the night, inflating, positioning, adjusting. By dawn, a ghost division would stand where empty fields had been. Then they would transmit false radio signals, play the sounds of tanks and trucks through speakers hidden in the woods, send out spoof patrols, small groups wearing different unit patches, deliberately letting themselves be seen by French civilians who might be questioned by German intelligence. Every detail mattered. The tire tracks leading into the fake base had to look worn, as if hundreds of vehicles had passed. The camouflage had to be imperfect, too perfect, and it looked fake. Even the latrines had to be dug, even though no one would use them, because reconnaissance photos would show them. They were creating a complete lie, a lie so thorough that reality itself seemed to bend. But their most dangerous mission came in March 1945, Operation Viersen. The objective: deceive the Germans about where the American Ninth Army would cross the Rhine River, Germany's last natural barrier before the heartland. The stakes could not have been higher. The Rhine crossing would involve thousands of American soldiers in boats, vulnerable and exposed, under the eyes and guns of German defenders dug into the far bank. If the Germans knew where the crossing would happen, they could concentrate their artillery and machine guns. The river would run red. The Ghost Army's mission: make the Germans believe the crossing would occur at Viersen, while the real crossing happened 10 miles north at Rheinberg. For 2 weeks, the Ghost Army transformed the area around Viersen into a staging ground for invasion. They positioned hundreds of inflatable tanks and artillery pieces. They played recordings of bridge construction day and night, the clang of metal, the rumble of heavy equipment, the shouts of engineers. They broadcast false radio traffic, coordinating a massive assault. They sent officers wearing the insignia of the Ninth Army into nearby towns, deliberately letting themselves be seen. They accidentally left maps in cafes, marked with attack plans for Viersen. And they waited. German intelligence analyzed the evidence. Reconnaissance flights confirmed it. Radio intercepts supported it. Local informants reported it. The Germans moved divisions to Viersen. They fortified the banks, positioned artillery, prepared for the Americans to come. On the night of March 23rd, the real Ninth Army crossed at Rheinberg, 10 miles away. The Germans, staring at Viersen, didn't see them coming until it was too late. By the time German commanders realized the deception, American troops were across the Rhine, establishing bridgeheads, pushing into Germany. The Ghost Army had done it. But in their command post, miles from the crossing, the men listened to the radio reports with expressions that weren't quite celebration. Because they knew what their illusion had meant. Real German soldiers, positioned at Viersen because of the Ghost Army's lie, had been unable to defend Rheinberg. Some of those German soldiers died confused, betrayed by their own intelligence. And across the river, American soldiers who would have died in a bloodbath lived. War's mathematics are written in blood, no matter which side. The Ghost Army had learned to add and subtract lives with canvas and sound. And some nights, that knowledge was harder to carry than any rifle. The Ghost Army was never in the front lines, but that doesn't mean they were safe. German reconnaissance planes occasionally spotted them positioning equipment. Artillery fire, blind but searching, sometimes found them. There were injuries. There were close calls that left men shaking, staring at the place where a shell had landed 20 feet away. But the real danger was subtler. It was the knowledge that if they were captured, the enemy would realize what they were. And that realization would ripple backward through intelligence networks. Every past deception would be questioned. Every current operation compromised. So they carried cyanide capsules, just in case. They were ordered to destroy all evidence of their unit if overrun. The inflatable tanks would be slashed and burned, the sound equipment smashed, the radio codes destroyed. They would become, in death, as invisible as they were in life. One veteran later recalled, "We joked about it. Gallows humor, you know. We'd say we were the only unit in the army where surrender wasn't an option. Not because we were brave, but because if we got caught, the whole trick was blown." But beyond physical danger, there was a psychological toll. These men were artists, creators. They'd been trained to bring beauty into the world, to paint, to design, to build things that moved the soul. Now they used those same skills to deceive, to lie so convincingly that men died because of where they weren't. Some of them struggled with it. In letters they couldn't send, letters they wrote anyway and kept hidden, they wrestled with the morality of their work. One soldier wrote, "We're saving American lives. I tell myself that every day. But I wonder about the German soldier standing watch where we put our fake tanks, staring into the darkness, thinking an attack is coming. Is he scared? Does he have a family? And when the real attack comes 10 miles away and he's not there to defend it? Does it matter that we tricked him? Is there honor in that?" Another wrote, "I used to paint landscapes, now I paint lies. And the strangest part is, I'm good at it. Maybe too good." But they kept working, because they also knew the other side of the equation. For every German soldier deceived, an American soldier made it home. For every shell fired at a rubber tank, a real soldier wasn't hit. For every hour the Germans spent preparing for a phantom attack, the real attack had more time to succeed. The Ghost Army was saving lives by making death aim at shadows. And if that was their burden to carry, they would carry it. But they were still soldiers, still young men, far from home, living in the strange space between danger and absurdity. And so, like all soldiers, they found moments of humanity in the chaos. Between missions, when they waited in camps behind the lines, they sketched, they painted, they turned their tent walls into murals. They drew portraits of each other, caricatures of their officers, scenes of the French countryside that somehow looked peaceful in watercolor. They put on shows, actual theatrical performances for other units, using their talents to bring laughter to men who'd seen too much death. One veteran remembered a performance where they built an entire fake nightclub, complete with cardboard champagne bottles and a chanteuse played by a 6-foot-tall sergeant in a dress. For 2 hours, he said, nobody thought about the war. They befriended French civilians in the towns they passed through, children who would watch, fascinated, as these strange American soldiers inflated giant rubber tanks. Old men who would share wine and stories, never quite understanding what these soldiers actually did. One Ghost Army veteran recalled a French farmer who watched them set up a fake artillery battery in his field. The farmer approached, confused, and touched one of the guns. It wobbled. He looked at the American soldier, then back at the gun, then started laughing. "Americans," he said, shaking his head with a smile. "Fous. Crazy." The soldier put a finger to his lips. The farmer nodded, still smiling, and walked away. He never told anyone what he'd seen, because even the French understood this madness might save lives. But the Ghost Army also witnessed the real war. They saw the convoys of wounded being evacuated. They passed through towns that had been shelled to rubble. They bivouacked in fields still scattered with the debris of battle. A German helmet here, a burned-out tank there, the small crosses marking hasty graves. And occasionally they saw the units they'd helped protect, real armored divisions moving up to the front, their tanks solid and heavy, their soldiers young and scared and trying to look brave. The Ghost Army men would watch them pass, and they'd know. Maybe, somewhere back there, those soldiers had advanced through a gap that existed because German forces had been pulled away, chasing ghosts. They couldn't say anything, couldn't explain, couldn't tell those soldiers, "We're the reason some of you will make it home." So they just watched, and carried that quiet knowledge like a secret prayer. The war in Europe ended on May 8, 1945. For most soldiers, that meant celebration, liberation, the beginning of the long journey home. For the Ghost Army, it meant a different kind of duty. They were assembled and given orders that would define the next 50 years of their lives. Everything they had done was classified. Everything they had seen was secret. They were not to speak of their missions, not to their families, not to their friends, not to other veterans, not even to each other once they separated. The 23rd Headquarters Special Troops would disappear from official records. The inflatable tanks would be destroyed or buried. The sound equipment would be locked away in warehouses. The after-action reports would be stamped top secret and filed in archives where they would gather dust for decades. And the men themselves would go home with a story they couldn't tell. They returned to America as veterans of a war where they'd never fired a shot. They went to reunions where other soldiers swapped combat stories, and they stayed quiet. They applied for jobs and listed their unit, and no one had heard of it. Their wives asked, "What did you do in the war?" And they answered, "I can't talk about it." Their children asked, "Were you a hero, Dad?" And they said, "I just did my job." Some of them went back to art. Bill Blass became a fashion icon. Ellsworth Kelly became one of the 20th century's most important painters. Art Kane photographed jazz legends and Hollywood stars. Others became architects, teachers, advertisers. They built lives that were real and solid, far removed from the world of inflatable deceptions. But they carried the secret for 10 years, 20 years, 30 years. Some died without ever being able to tell their families what they'd done. Their obituaries listed their service in World War II, but nothing more. They were ghosts twice over, once on the battlefield and once in history. The irony was not lost on them. They had created illusions that deceived the enemy, and then they themselves became the illusion. The soldiers who didn't exist, who hadn't done what they'd done, whose contribution vanished into classified silence. One veteran later said, "We won by lying, and then we had to lie about winning. For 50 years, we were the secret even we couldn't tell." But secrets eventually fade. In 1996, 51 years after the war ended, the United States government finally declassified the records of the 23rd Headquarters Special Troops. The Ghost Army at last could speak. Many of the original 1100 were gone by then. But the survivors, now in their 70s and 80s, finally had permission to tell their story. At first, no one quite believed them. Rubber tanks, fake armies, sound effects of construction equipment used to trick the Germans. It sounded like fiction, like a Hollywood movie script. But the documents were real. The photographs emerged from archives, haunting images of soldiers positioning inflatable Shermans, of canvas artillery pieces that looked convincing enough to fool enemy reconnaissance. The after-action reports detailed mission after mission of successful deception. Historians began to study the Ghost Army's impact. They calculated that the unit's 21 missions had potentially saved between 10,000 and 30,000 American lives. Soldiers who would have faced fiercer resistance, heavier casualties, if German forces hadn't been deceived and misdirected. The veterans began to speak publicly. They gave interviews. They wrote memoirs. They attended ceremonies where, for the first time, they wore their Ghost Army insignia with pride instead of silence. One veteran described the feeling, "For 50 years I carried this weight, this secret, and when I finally told my children what I'd really done, they just stared at me. My son said, 'Dad, that's the most incredible thing I've ever heard.' And I realized he was right. It was incredible. We did something incredible. And I'd been silent about it for half a century." A documentary was made. Books were written. Historians gave the Ghost Army its place in the story of World War II. Not as a footnote, but as a crucial element of Allied victory. In 2013, the surviving veterans were awarded the Congressional Gold Medal, one of America's highest civilian honors. They stood before Congress, old men now, some in wheelchairs, some leaning on canes. And America finally said, "Thank you, for the lies that saved lives, for the illusions that won battles, for the silence you kept when you deserved celebration." One veteran accepting the medal said simply, "We were just trying to bring our boys home." But perhaps the most moving moment came when the veterans met the families of soldiers who'd served in the real units they'd protected. Men whose fathers or grandfathers had crossed the Rhine at Rheinberg, who'd advanced through France while German forces were pulled away by phantom threats, who'd survived battles because the enemy was shooting at ghosts. The families thanked them, and the Ghost Army veterans, many with tears in their eyes, finally understood the full weight of what they'd done. They hadn't just created illusions, they'd created futures, families that existed because a soldier came home, children who were born because their father survived, grandchildren who carried forward a life that, without the Ghost Army's deception, might never have been. War is fought with bullets and bombs, with steel and fire. But sometimes, it's the illusions that save lives. The Ghost Army understood something profound. That reality, in war, is what the enemy believes. And if you can control what they believe, you can control where they fight and where they don't. 1,100 men, artists, dreamers, creators, discovered that their pencils and paintbrushes could be weapons. That canvas and rubber could stop tanks. That sound recordings could move armies. They learned that deception, used carefully, used precisely, could be an act of mercy. Because every German soldier shooting at a fake tank was a German soldier not shooting at real Americans. Every hour German commanders spent planning to counter a phantom division was an hour American forces had to advance. Every shell fired at an empty field was a shell that didn't hit a young man who wanted to go home. The Ghost Army fought a war where victory meant no one died because of them, where success was measured not in enemies killed, but in friends saved. And for 50 years they carried that knowledge in silence. Because the greatest deception of all was making the world forget they existed. But now we remember. We remember the artists who went to war armed with imagination. We remember the soldiers who proved that courage doesn't always mean charging into fire. Sometimes courage means standing in a field at midnight, inflating a rubber tank, knowing that if your deception fails, real people will pay the price. Sometimes courage means carrying a secret for half a century, never seeking glory, never demanding recognition. Sometimes courage means being a ghost. The men of the 23rd Headquarters Special Troops taught us that war is not just about destroying the enemy. Sometimes it's about confusing them, misleading them, making them waste their strength fighting shadows. While the real soldiers, The real people slip past in the darkness and make it home. In the end, the Ghost Army's greatest illusion was this: they made death look the wrong way, and life, real life, walked through the door they'd opened. If this story moved you, if you believe these voices of courage deserve to be heard, then join us here at Battle Echoes, where we tell the forgotten stories of World War II, the stories of ordinary people who did extraordinary things, the stories of heroes who never sought the title, the stories that remind us that war is fought not just by generals and armies, but by individuals, each one making choices, each one carrying their own burden. Subscribe to Battle Echoes, share these stories, keep these memories alive, because the veterans are leaving us now. But their stories can echo forever. Thank you for listening. And thank you to the Ghost Army, the soldiers who fought with illusions, who saved thousands of lives, and who taught us that sometimes the most powerful weapon is the one the enemy never sees coming.